Good evening, everyone. We continue from where we left off last week in the book of First Samuel. We left off. We left off at verse 23, and today we continue with verse 24. Remember, in the last segment, uh, the that Jonathan had started the routing of the Philistines, and they were running away. And it is time for the second part where Saul is getting involved in this campaign. In verse 24, we are told that Saul began by having a an oath or a ban, I guess you could call that. It says, now the men of Israel were hard pressed. The word hard pressed uh, is caused to be, how should we say? Um, well, you could say that this is hard pressed by Saul. And you could think of it as Saul being very demanding. Now, as we begin, I think from verse 24 onwards, um, should remind us of First Samuel chapter 8. The First Samuel chapter 8 was at a time when the people demanded a human king. And as Samuel uh, approached God, and God says, tell them all these things and forewarn them of how a human king would behave. And in that entire part of the second half of First Samuel chapter 8, we find that God had been very just and fair with the people to tell them what a human king would do. They would take their sons and daughters who will have armies, they would take the best of their lives, and yet they the people had said, yes, we would want the human king. And so I allude to First Samuel chapter 8 because from verse 24 onwards, we begin to see the behavior of a human king, because this is the first time they actually had a human king. And the men of Israel who were in that battle were being oppressed by Saul, and Saul was also there part of the battle and had high demands on the people. And they put the people under oath. Now, this word oath is is a form of a swear. It is a formal how should you say, a formal oath of a fasting. Okay? This is a fasting oath, and there's a ban on eating. Now, we may not appreciate exactly what Saul is doing, but what Saul has done is that he had put everyone under a ban. And this is a formal ban that cursed be the man who eats food before evening, which means that this is a time where they do not think about food. They have to be on a fast until Saul completes the route on the Philistines. And so the event calls for no food, and so none of the people tasted food. Now, that is the background of this second half of chapter 14. And let's be very clear that this is about an oath. This is about Saul doing it. Can he do it? Of course. He is now the king. And the king can decide to do whatever the king decides to do. And this is the first time we are encountering a human king. And it's not what God has said, it's what Saul has said. And so now they also see that below God, they have a king. and the people are here. And as God has forewarned them in 1 Samuel chapter 8, that you must adhere to the antics, the whims and fancies of the human king. And God says that in the day that you are there to complain about the king, God says, I will not bother to hear you if you so demand a king. And so these were all warnings that God has given them, and they said, so be it. And that's it. And so this chapter 14, verse 24, is to show us how things will be, or how things became under the human king of Saul. So let's begin by understanding what actually transpired after the ban of not eating was put in place. In verse 25, the narrative now goes to the point of describing how the people began to go after the Philistines. They entered into the, I guess, the highlands of Ephraim, the hills of Ephraim, where there is a forest. So they entered the land of the forest. Now, this word forest, or translated as forest, uh, actually means woods in English, right? They actually means thick thick bushes. These are all possible meanings. Uh, it also does mean honey in the comb. In the comb, inside the trees. Now, this is what I want to point out to you, that um, basically there is a play on the word forest, ya'ar. Right, let me just put it down, ya'ar. And as they entered this place, there was honey on the ground, which means that in the thick woods where there is the honeycombs found inside the woods, they were so rich that it was dripping honey. Okay, that is what it means. It was dripping honey, and it dripped onto the ground. Verse 26, when the people entered this place, behold, there was a flow of honey. What does this mean? It means that the honey was going down to the ground. And it is very enticing, which means that there is food available. But remember, there is a ban by Saul, a formal oath of a ban. And so when they came and saw this, behold means you can see it. Look, there is honey flowing to the ground, but no man put his hand to his mouth, for the people feared the oath. Now, the oath in Hebrew, as a formal oath, has to be obeyed or carried out, because it is not something that is said in whims and fancy. So the people feared the oath by saying that there is a punishment if the oath is violated or not carried out. Verse 27. But Jonathan had not heard when his father put the people under oath. And so he put out the end of the staff. Now, this word staff is it's a stick, I guess, a little reed. Uh not so much as a log of wood, but possibly a reed, and he dipped it into the honeycomb, and then put his hand to his mouth, and his eyes brightened. And this is very interesting. So what does that mean? He, right here, he ate food and thereby violated the ban, right? But because they were also hungry, the honey that went into his mouth caused his eyes to brighten up. And so in the modern day, we would say that his eyes lit up because now he has energy. And that's basically what we're seeing here. Once sugar gets into the system, uh, he is now more energized, so to speak, right? The eyes lit up. And then one of the people said, your father strictly put the people under oath. Now, what does that mean? Your father strictly put the people under oath. And the word strictly put under oath is uh, gave an absolute oath. This is something that is sworn, right? Something that is sworn by the name of God. And then he described that it is cursed be the man who eats food today. Now, without going into the details, verse 28 will come back to haunt Saul. So, cursed be the man who eats food today literally means this man now would be Jonathan, because Jonathan was the only one who ate. The rest of the people were weary. Now, this word weary, uh, I guess you could say that they were faint. They were faint. Their energy was flying away. I think this is a more literal, a more imagery type of word, right? Flying away. And so the people were faint. And so their whole focus is really not there because of their hunger. And the hunger was caused by the ban. That was, cursed be the man who eats food today. Today means before evening. Before evening. Now, when we continue to verse 29, it says, then Jonathan said, my father has disturbed the land. Now, the word trouble here uh, means to stir up, stir up, uh, disturb, right? Disturb, stir up, uh, created a taboo, right? Created a taboo or a ban on the land. Then that would be the people of the land. And so there is confusion that that Saul had done. And so Jonathan disagreed with the father. And so he said, see now, look how my eyes have lit up because I tasted a little of this honey. And this tells us that he was energized. And so he feels that the ban is really not a good thing to do. And he again defended this. He says, how much more if only the people had eaten freely today of the spoil of their enemies, which they found. For the slaughter among the Philistines has not been great. And he blames it on the ban, right? The ban to eat. that it would have been greater if they had more energy. That's verse 30. Verse 31, they struck among the Philistines that day from Michmash to Ayalon. And the people were very weary. Not just down, it was just faint. Now it was very faint, or how you say, greatly faint. They were now even more hungry from the entire episode. Verse 32. The people rushed greedily upon the spoil and took sheep, oxen, calves, slew them on the ground, and the people ate them with the blood. And this is what we need to describe a little bit. This word rushed, I think you can think of this as literally screaming and swooping, uh, rushing. All these are good words. The picture here is that the people were so hungry that now they have struck the Philistines. It is nighttime. Understand this. It is nighttime. And so they went and rushed upon the spoil that the Philistines had. This is the plunder. And immediately took sheep, oxen, and calves and slaughtered them to eat, of course. On the ground, slaughtered them on the ground, and the people ate with the blood. And this is what we need to deal with. It seems that based on the ritual, the ritual amongst the Israelites is that when the animal is slaughtered, the blood is collected in a basin. And by ritual, the blood has to be properly discarded by pouring it onto the ground. And then they are supposed to make an offering to God because they have won the battle. Now, because the people were so hungry, all of these were discarded or ignored, or you would say overlooked. And so before the blood was dealt with in a proper ritual, the people started to eat, and hence that became a problem. Why? Because there is a ritual violation. A ritual violation is called a khatat, a miss, or in the English, it's called a sin, right? It's called a sin. And so look at what Saul said. They told Saul, saying, behold, the people are sinning against God by eating with the blood. They are not being carnivorous here. They are doing it because they were so hungry that they forgot the ritual. So it is a ritual violation of not dealing with the blood. And he said, you all have acted treacherously. The idea of treacherously means you have acted, you have offended God, I would say. Yeah, you have offended God. And so he is trying to fix the situation by saying, roll a great stone to me today. Now, this whole idea of rolling a great stone to me today is for him to set up an altar to do what is right by fixing the offense. So all of these are background information based on the fact that the Torah in the book of Leviticus had provided for all these things. Verse 34. So Saul said, disperse yourself, and the word disperse here means scatter, right? Scatter. Scatter yourselves among the people and say to them, each of you bring me his ox or his sheep and slaughter it here and then only eat. And do not sin against the Lord by eating with the blood. So finish the ritual. Basically, do it properly. If you violation is sin. And so all the people that night, remember, they actually won the battle at night, brought his ox with him and slaughtered it there. Verse 35, and Saul built an altar to the Lord, and it was the first altar that he built to the Lord. We've never seen Saul relating to God like how Moses would, like how Abraham would. He actually had dealt with his own way before he ever thought of God. Now, this is an important aspect that we can see, that they had actually done a couple of things. Well, in the earlier chapters, when there was Nahash, right, the Ammonite, and they won it, so they went to Gilgal, right, for the offering. But in chapter 34, they had a number of battles that they won, and they forgot about God until now. Verse 36. Then Saul said, now, after we've done this, let us go down after the Philistines by night, which means that very night. Take spoil among them until the morning, and let us not leave a man of them. And they said, do whatever seems good to you. So the priest is there as well. Let us draw near to God here. So now we've got two opinions. The people is number one, the people, the priests. So the people listen to Saul. The priests advised Saul to look for God, because that is the role of the priest, after all, is to remind the king and the people of the presence of God and calling upon God to show his will, I guess. You can think of it that way, right? Now let's look at verse 37 and 38. And so Saul listened to the priests. So Saul inquired of God. Now think of it this way: the inquiring of God is about, how should you say, is to ask for a favor of God. And in this case, you can think of it as a prayer, right? A prayer or an intercession. And in this case, it's because before they go down, they have to actually seek God. In the past, Samuel would be the one that tells them that God has said this. But now the priest reminds the king, shouldn't you ask of God? And so this is to show us the order of authority. Remember, I will draw this again for you. There's God, king, and people. So it is king to people, but ultimately it should be God to king and then king to people. And this is the part where the priests have reminded Saul that you need to ask God. So Saul asked, shall I go down after the Philistines? Will you give them into the hand of Israel? Will this be a victorious battle? But God did not answer him that day, which tells Saul that something is amiss. Something is amiss. That is what it means. There is something wrong. God usually will answer, but there seems to be something that they have to deal with. And according to Saul, he says, draw near here, all you chiefs of the people. All you chiefs would be all the leaders by tribes. And investigate. The word investigate literally comes from the word see. To see and see how this sin has happened today. What sin? Now, this is with regards to the response, right? It's a response to God not answering, and in Saul's mind, something happened. Something happened, that there was a sin that has deterred God from answering. In verse 39, we can continue here. For as the Lord lives, this as the Lord lives is also an oath. As God lives, who is this God? The God who saves Israel. And he makes this oath that if it is Jonathan, my son, he shall surely die. This is how serious Saul was, that this sin has to be dealt with so that he would get a response from God. And if it was Jonathan who had caused it, he will die as well. But nobody of the people answered him. Why? Because they knew who had actually broken or violated the ban of eating. Verse 40. Then he said to all Israel, remember all Israel, 12 tribes. He says, you shall be on one side, and I and Jonathan, my son, will be on the other side. And for all intents and purposes, then we would have the separation of Saul with the people. Right? This is the 12 tribes. This is Saul and Jonathan. Now, this is how the narrative goes. They are drawing lots to determine by God, and the lots is believed that God is showing directions. And it is likely that you'll be thinking of the Urim and Thummim, the two stones that the high priest carries in the tunic, and they use it to determine God's answers. And so, based on this, the people said to Saul, and this one I hope that we all remember, do what seems good to you. And this tells us that they are submitting to the king, regardless of what the king wants to do. And this is the people. The priest talk to God. And so the priest is around here. Verse 41, therefore Saul said to the Lord, the God of Israel, By saying this, this is about the Umim and Tumim. And this is used by the priest. Give a perfect lot. This is to show God's decision. And once they drew the lot, then Jonathan and Saul were taken, but the people escaped. Now, what does that mean? This means that the lot, the lot fell on Saul and Jonathan because they were inquiring who actually sinned against God that God did not answer. The people escaped basically means that the lot did not fall on them. That is what it means by the fact that they escaped. Verse 42, Saul said, now cast again between me and Jonathan. There are only two left. Two left. And so we have Saul and we have Jonathan. After they cast the lot, Jonathan was taken. And so what we can see is that Jonathan would be the one that had the lot. This one had the lot, and Jonathan had the lot. Now, that is all that's happened. And this is a process of drawing lots to show who God is pointing to. Not something that we are familiar with today, but this is the narrative of 1 Samuel 14. Verse 43, Saul said to Jonathan, why did the lot fall on you? Tell me what you have done. And this is with regards to the violation that stopped God from answering Saul. And that is how Saul is dealing with the matter. So Jonathan told him and said, I indeed tasted a little honey with the end of the staff that was in my hand. So this is the fact. He admitted, yes, I ate. Now, he didn't give an excuse, right? Like Genesis chapter 3, the woman that you gave me made me eat. So Jonathan came out and admitted, and so he volunteered. Here I am, I must die. And this word here I am, is behold, look, I'm here. That's what it means. And this phrase, I must die, or I will die, or I die, as a submission to judgment. That is how honorable Jonathan was. So, verse 44, Saul said, may God do this to me and more also, for you shall surely die, Jonathan. Verse 44, this word surely die literally means not that he's going to be immediately dead, but based on the judgment, he will eventually be executed in that sense, right? So the word surely die is a definite, or what we will call a foregone conclusion, that he will take the punishment, but it is not an immediate destruction of life. That's what the phrase actually means. 45, which is the last verse. Verse 45. But the people said to Saul, Saul, must Jonathan die, who has brought out about this great deliverance from Israel? What does this mean? They are asking, why should Jonathan die? Why? Because Jonathan had fought, Jonathan led the victory, right? The deliverance of Israel. And so the people made a conclusion. Far from it, as the Lord lives, not one hair of his head shall fall to the ground, for he has worked with God this day. The people, right? The people atoned for Jonathan in the fact that in the violation of the ban, there was a provision for an atonement in the book of Leviticus. And so the people rescued Jonathan and he did not die. And the word rescue here means redeemed. Redeem Jonathan or buy back, right? Buy back. This is a concept of, of atoning and redemption of Jonathan as a concept of a rescue, provided for whatever he has done wrong according to the Torah, and gave him a release and a pardon from God. And that is verse 45. In the next segment here, from verses 46 all the way to the end, which is in verse 52, the 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 the, the sin was settled. There was an atonement by inference. There was a redemption, and the redemption would imply that all the requirements of the Torah with regards to a breaking of an oath would be dealt with. And so now look at verse 46. And I just want to point out to you that Saul became the warrior of Israel. And according to 1 Samuel chapter 8, God had already said, forewarned them that your king would want to go and fight and will take your sons and daughters and recruit them and bring them along in the battle, according to what the king wants to do. And so what does the king want to do? Saul continued to chase the Philistines all the way back to their own land. Verse 47. And when Saul had taken the kingdom over Israel, means relieved Israel of any of a foreign oppression, he fought against all his enemies on every side. Now think of it this way. If this is Israel, if this is Israel, Saul would fight against the Philistines, and then he fought against the Ammonites. He fought against Edom. He fought against the Moabites. And so that was what Saul did, right? From a single point, he went after all the neighboring nations. This is the description of verse 47. He fought against all his enemies on every side, against Moab, the sons of Ammon, Edom, the kings of Zobah, and the Philistines. And wherever he turned, he inflicted punishment. And he was a mighty warrior. The implications would be the people will be affected. Right? Will be affected. Verse 48. He acted valiantly. Well, 48, when he talks about valiantly, he acted with might, with great strength. He defeated the Amalekites and saved Israel from the hands of those who plundered them. Uh, what happened is that every now and then uh, there would be enemies that would come in and take things away from Israel. It showed that at that point in time, Israel was weak, and now with Saul, Israel was strong. And, and that's what is being left here. Israel is a power nation now under Saul. And so this is the picture that we are leaving in verse 48. Now, from verse 49 onwards, it would be an idea of the, I guess, the genealogy of Saul. So let's take a look. The sons of Saul were Jonathan, Ishvi, you have Malki Shua, and the names of his two daughters. The firstborn was Merav, and the younger was Michal, right? Michal. And so if you were to draw the family tree, you would have Saul. I think we would draw it further down so that we can see the rest of it. And with him, he has all these children, two daughters and four sons. So we have Jonathan, Ishvi, three sons, Malkishua, right? Three sons. And then we have two daughters, Merav, and Michal, right? Michal. That is the picture of verse 49. So you can actually build this as well. Now we look at verse 50. The name of Saul's wife was Ahi Noam, right? Ahi Noam. So you can put here Saul and Ahi Noam. The daughter of Ahi Ma'atz. That's how we pronounce that, Ahi Ma'atz. Now, the interesting information here would be the name of the captain of his army. Notice in the biblical times, they always use this word, the captain. And in today's terminology, this would be the general. So captain would be the leader of the army of Saul, and he would be Avner, or how should I say, Aviner, right? Aviner, the son of Ner, and he was Saul's uncle. And Kish was the father of Saul, and Ner, the father of Avner, was the son of Aviel. And now let's piece it all together. We have Aviel, Aviel. Aviel has two sons. We have Kish and we have Ner. And the son of Ner would be Avner, right? Aviner, right? Aviner. And Kish would have a son called Saul. And that is why it says that Ner is the uncle of Saul, because he would be the brother of Saul's father. And this provides us with a bird's eye view of the heritage of Saul, as we can see it in verses 49 to 51. Now we come to the end of this chapter. That would be verse 52. And so let's get to verse 52, and then you can see the effects of a human king. Now the war against the Philistines, or the battle against the Philistines, was severe all the days of Saul. And Saul would be fighting. And when Saul saw any mighty man or any valiant man, he attached him to his staff. Basically, Saul recruited all the strong men. From the sons of Israel, the 12 tribes, he was building an immense army because Saul was a fighter. And so now Israel will go into battle all the days of Saul's life. Now you can imagine if Saul's life was very long, it would have been an intense many years of battle. And so we saw in 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 1, that Saul reigned only for about two odd years. And so that entire reign of Saul was tumultuous. Now, what we're going to see is that tomorrow in 1 Samuel chapter 15 shows us the character of Saul. Now, verse 52 right here merely shows us that Saul is a man who wants to go and fight. And in so doing, he drags the entire nation with him. In chapter 15 comes the second judgment of God upon Saul, such that we see I would say we'll leave it for tomorrow. Some very interesting words will be said with regards to Saul. And with this, we come to the end of chapter 14.